So Andy, you asked me to talk a little bit about the idea of the common good. And I think the common good is a tricky idea to get your head round, not because it's hugely complicated, but because it's a phrase that's used consistently, but it's used consistently to mean very different things. So one version of the common good, a kind of secular version that we hear from politicians very often, is basically to talk about the common good really meaning the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So in other words, the common good is a kind of sum total of goods in a society. Well, there's a point of contrast already with what a Christian would mean by the common good, because the common good for a Christian is not necessarily the greatest good for the greatest number, but in fact the other way round, the greatest good for the least. So a Christian understanding of the common good begins always bottom up. It begins with an option for the poor. So first of all, we need to say the common good is about an understanding of unity, equality, and dignity in human relations. And because the nature of our society constantly cross-cuts the unity, equality, and dignity of our human relations, we will always need to ask a question first in Christian common good thinking about the impact of public policy, the impact of the way in which we live societally, the impact of the way that we trade with each other in financial relations on those who have materially the least. So for that reason, Christian common good thinking tends to almost automatically disturb and challenge the way in which the common good gets used by politicians in day-to-day discourse, who primarily are tending to think about that middle lump in society as opposed to thinking about a social whole. Now, here's another misunderstanding of the common good that helps us then highlight what a more genuine Christian understanding of the common good might be. The common good is goods that you and I can agree on. So in other words, you and I, Andy, need to have a lot of time in a seminar room where we basically thrash out a common agreement on how the world should look, okay? Now, I don't know, it might be quite easy for you and I to do that, but I could think of some other folk where it might be trickier for either you or I to agree with them on what our goods in common might be. Now, fortunately, God didn't invent the world as a seminar room. Therefore, our focus for the common good as Christians is not so much on reaching common agreement on things, and more how we express and explore a life in communion. And for you and I to be in a relationship of communion doesn't require us to agree on everything. It requires a disposition in both of us to look at the other as God might see the other. It requires us to understand the fundamental dignity, the individuality, and the relationality of that person who's before us. So a Christian understanding of the common good starts with an option for the poorest, not just the best for the most. Secondly, it doesn't start with an understanding of what we can agree in common. It begins with a vision of life in communion. Now, in terms of first principles, why does it begin with a vision of life in communion? Because ultimately in the Christian tradition, there is one true common good, and that one true common good is God. It's the life for which we're destined. So in a sense, the true common good is God, and then we think backwards, at least in my Catholic tradition, we think backwards from that vision of God as the true common good into thinking, okay, so what are the implications for the way in which life in God is understood to be, for the life that we live together in this world as a preparation for the life that we receive in God. So that has then a number of consequences. So I need to live in this life as if I am living in communion with others, that the logic of the way that I live in the world is to be with and alongside others in relationships of accompaniment that profoundly speak of human relationality, solidarity, dignity, and so forth. So in order to understand what the implications of the common good might be, that kind of vision of life in communion for the social world, the theological tradition leads us down particular lines of thought. The first being, we need to hold at the forefront of our minds in terms of public policy, in terms of the broader political process and how we build political community and political movements, a certain vision of the human person. And that's a vision of the human person made for relationship with each other, made with capacities for creativity and self-determination and a capacity to shape the world around them. And that human person needs to be the focal point, the priority, if you like, for thinking about political action. Now, if you take the framework of that human person, how is that person best kind of supported and nurtured within the social order? Well, that requires, according to common good thinking, first of all, a set of what's called intermediate associations and structures that help build the social order. So in the medieval period, this might have been guilds. In the modern period, who knows, this might be Christians in politics. But the important thing is that there are organs which lie, institutions and groups and associations between the level of the individual and the state. And these are the contexts in which we learn the social virtues necessary for the common good. We learn what you're trying to do today, how to talk about difficult issues in the context of a moral vision for society as a whole. And it's only by learning to do these things together that we actually generate the necessary virtues for a society based on the common good. So one philosopher, John Haldane, has this kind of analogy that he uses for the common good, and you can decide whether you think this is helpful or not. But he says the common good and trying to achieve it is a little bit like a good mood at a party. A good mood at the party is not something that the host alone can manufacture. You can't decide to have a great party. The atmosphere of a great party is generated by the participation and the intermingling of all of those who attend the party. They contribute through their interaction to the building of a great social event. And so, in a sense, the common good is more like that. It's something that we generate through being orientated towards the common good with a genuineness and a seriousness and a playfulness and a sense of humour about it too. And through our contribution to exercising those muscles, to building those virtues together in smaller units, we begin to generate the atmosphere necessary, the practices and the content of the common good. But understanding it precisely, and it's why Haldane's example works, as an experience in communion. That's kind of what a good party is. That's what good worship is. Yeah? So in a sense, we're understanding it, communion, life together, something that we learn to participate in and nurture through these social groups. But the state has a role in this as well within Catholic social teaching. So the common good is the ultimate reason, it's the raison d'etre that the state itself exists. If it weren't for the necessity of building the common good, there would be no need for the state and for politics. So it is the telos, the end point, the essential nature and call and vocation of the state itself as a political structure. But it isn't, as the analogy of the party suggests, it isn't just the state that's responsible for the common good. The common good is something that we're all responsible for generating. And in fact, in most forms of Christian thought, you can only get to that condition for the common good if you've got wider forms of social participation. It really isn't just about the state, but neither is it about the absence of the state. Both have a relationship within, in a sense, civil society as a whole. So it doesn't really trip off the tongue. So this is the health warning before I say this. But the definition that Catholic social teaching uses of the common good, it goes something like this. The common good is the sum total of the conditions, the social conditions, necessary for the flourishing of individuals and groups within the social whole. So in other words, those individual groups and associations committed to the option for the poor, committed to solidarity, committed to practices of subsidiarity, protecting the priority of labour over capital, they bring together the possibility for the common good within society. So somehow it's slightly difficult to get hold of, and yet at the same time it's something so blindingly obvious, because really it's about neighbour love. Really it's about a community rooted in solidarity. So when the state is involved in orientating itself towards the common good, raises really important questions about law and the nature of law. So we need to think about legislation within the framework of the common good as being not just rules that are enacted, but actually culture formation. So our legislation is acting either actively for or against the common good. There's no such thing as neutral legislation. It sits there and it forms and deforms the potential for virtue within society more broadly. So clear attention to the cultural implications of legislation, not merely as rules, but as an orientation towards life, that really requires our attention. So whilst the vision of the common good might be something which is deeply attractive to us as Christians, it's also something which we need to be aware of is always going to be problematic, is always going to bring conflict and difficulty. And in a sense, the biblical framework speaks to us of this. So on the one hand, we're given in Scripture a memory, a deep memory that we keep going back to through worship and through liturgy of this vision of communion and of life together and of solidarity. But what the Scriptures also do, perhaps just as helpfully, is tell us about how it all goes wrong, constantly, all the time, that we're always going to be faced with dilemmas about discerning what the common good might be. And so there are some really kind of sharp, pointed ways in which common good thinking might challenge the direction and the flow of our own politics right now. So it might, for example, ask us to ask questions about Sunday trading rules. It might ask us to think, okay, hang on a minute, if we've just been talking about the necessity of the priority of labour over capital for forming a common good culture and the apex of work being leisure, hang on a minute, what do we want to have to say about what's happening to the idea of Sabbath rest and its possibility within our culture? We've just talked about a view of the human person as not being primarily an economic unit, but as a relational, creative unit. Okay, well, if we're saying that society should serve the human person, that the economy should serve the human person, what implications does that have for the way in which we might want to approach the question of Sunday trading? So it's not just things like living wages that fall under that labour and capital relation. More broadly, there are questions about how we trade and how we provide time for leisure and for recreation. One very brief story. A couple of years ago, actually probably more than a couple of years ago now, I ended up at the last minute having to chair 2 archbishops because somebody else had pulled out. And I phoned a friend of mine and I said to this friend of mine, who's a politician, on my way to go and chair this session that I hadn't prepared for, if you had 2 archbishops in the room and you wanted to put some pressure on them about the relationship between faith and politics, what would you ask them? And the politician said to me, I'd push them on 2 areas. I'd push them on the environment and I'd push them on refugees and migration. Because for some reason, politicians of all parties within the structure of liberal democracies struggle most to think ethically and morally about our duty to the non-citizen, to the stranger who arrives, as well as thinking about a duty towards the created order as a whole. So there is a particular role for the church, which has very clear moral thinking on both a duty towards the created order and also a duty towards the alien, the stranger, the foreigner and the exile, to bring that discourse right full frontal into public view. So for that reason, I think that the common good stuff can be really, really deeply challenging of the thrust, not just of one party or another, but actually of the structure of the way that liberal democracies tend to respond to very particular kinds of moral issues. We're pretty good in some ways on our duty to fellow citizens, to fellow human beings, but if we're thinking about other creatures, the created order, we're thinking about the non-citizen, at that point common good thinking seems to me to be pretty thin. Another area that we might want to think of is the challenge around welfare and statism. So on the one hand, there's part of the common good tradition which is very much orientated to saying there must be a role for political communities in providing basic frameworks of support and structure for those who find themselves, for whatever reason, not able to meet their own needs for sustenance and for human flourishing. So another area where there are some really challenging lines that are thrown down to us by common good thinking, Christian common good thinking, would be around welfare and thinking about welfare. So on the one hand, there's a whole chunk of common good thinking in the Christian tradition, which is absolutely about the role of political communities, the role of the state in providing safety nets, in providing support and enabling mechanisms for people who might find themselves, for whatever reason, unable to work, unable to house themselves, unable to provide support or health care for themselves. On the other hand, there's also another part of the tradition which is a little suspicious of a state-only or a statist solution to welfare. So a really good illustration of this from my own Catholic tradition is from John Paul II. John Paul II was building on some earlier comments in Catholic social teaching, which had been very much about backing the need for modern forms of state welfare. But he had some worries, and he added these as a kind of rider to the question about welfare. He said there are some things that the state, in a sense, simply cannot deliver. The state can deliver a certain level of bureaucratic support. It can provide a certain kind of transaction with the individual, which is usually financial, and it's usually a one-way kind of relation. However, true welfare and the genuine development of the flourishing of the person requires reciprocal relationships. It requires a deeper form of human exchange, and it requires quality relationships that are not primarily bureaucratic. And these are often best provided at a more local level. They're often best provided by people who can spend time devoted to the deeper welfare needs of the human person. And so John Paul II was very clear that whilst he wasn't against the idea the state should be involved in welfare at all, he wanted to challenge the idea of a culture that had moved towards what he saw as a transactional approach to welfare. And in place of that, he wanted one which was orientated more in a theology of gift, that was orientated more towards a complex grouping of groups and associations who might be involved in accompanying others, in being with others through their journey. So there's a sense in which common good thinking might on the one hand look like it backs a state welfare system, but equally it might look like it wants us to ask some questions about the general orientation of that system and the extent to which ever the state alone can deliver forms of welfare.